through an introduction to Jewish genealogy. And I want to thank as well our team at the Heinz History Center, Liz Dewar and Jamie Ersick, who have been in the back running this. A lot of people don't realize that these hybrid programs are actually exceptionally complicated logistically, and they're much harder than both in-person programs or online programs. But as an institution, we're really dedicated to doing it because A, we want to make these accessible to people who can't come, and B, we still want to encourage people to get together because we think that when people get in the room together is when the best things tend to happen. And then also I want to thank Steve and everybody at the JGS who continue to do such a great job to bring genealogical resources to Pittsburgh. So what I'm going to do is take all of the techniques and ideas that Emily has presented to you and bring them down to Western Pennsylvania and show you how to use the records that we have here, not only at the archives here at the Rauh Jewish Archives, but at other archives in Pittsburgh and even some archives that aren't in Pittsburgh, but that have Western Pennsylvania records. We have a little joke that we say at the archive, which is that we wish that the historians were like genealogists and we wish that the genealogists were like historians. And what I mean is, genealogists are incredibly dogged and they will go to any length to get the detail that they want. And we sometimes wish that historians would go to that same length to go get the details. Sometimes historians are busy, they're in a rush, they know what they want, they think they get what they want, and they kind of move on. And we always say, like, we wish that you would go as deep as the genealogists would go. And the flip side is that historians, they're really comfortable coming to the archive and they're really comfortable with context. And sometimes genealogists have a tendency to get laser focused on the particular record that they're looking for. And they also get comfortable with the online tools. And they don't necessarily always come to the archive to look for themselves. Sometimes that's because the archive is in a different place. But even when they're here in town, they don't always come in. And they're not always thinking bigger, which sometimes is where the answer is found. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a little section explaining what records are available and also the history of how those records got to be where they are so that you can start to understand the landscape locally. And then I'm going to do one little case study to show how you can use that information to better find things in the archives. So I'm going to start someplace that's a little bit unexpected. When we're thinking about Jewish records in Western Pennsylvania, I'm going to start in 1939, which is when the Works Progress Administration did something called the Church Archives Survey. This was just in Pennsylvania. And what they did was they went across the state and they attempted to locate every single house of worship in the state and do a little biographical information about that organization, that congregation, and then to list the records that they have available. And these are all on ancestry.com if you're interested in looking at them. They're not terribly useful for genealogical data. And the reason is because a lot of these records from 1939 didn't survive. We know that they once existed, but they're not here and we don't know where they are. I picked this congregation because Rodef Shalom in Denora is a congregation that we do have records for. So presumably we have all the records that exist or are known to exist. And I can tell you when you look at the list of records that are listed on that second sheet, they don't match. So over the years, somewhere between 1939 and 1990 or so, when those records were donated to us, they just disappeared. They were in somebody's house, they got thrown out. We don't know what happened to them. Maybe they're in an attic somewhere and they'll show up eventually. The reason that these didn't exist is because there was nowhere to put them. That's the basic reason. It wasn't that there were no archives, it was that the archives weren't thinking about collecting this type of record at that time. There's an irony, which is that in 1941, Marcus Rauh of the Rauh Jewish Archives family was a trustee here at the Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania. So you can see that even though the people were in the right place, it didn't always add up to everybody. That doesn't change until after World War II. One of the things that World War II did was it shifted the center of Jewish life from Europe, where it had been for about 1,000 years, to America. Suddenly, America was the most important Jewish community in the world. Israel, of course, had a Jewish community, but there was no state yet. And so all of a sudden, this community in America, which had always been kind of a younger brother, had to catch up. And the person who is kind of singly responsible for creating Jewish archives in America is someone named Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus. He was actually local. He was born in New Haven, Pennsylvania, which is a little town outside of Connellsville. And he had family connections in Homestead, and he grew up in, I think, Wheeling, West Virginia. And he went to Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He became a rabbi, and then he became the history professor at Hebrew Union College. And that meant that every single Reform rabbi who went through Hebrew Union College went through his classroom. And so he was able to do two things. One is that he created the American Jewish Archives, and then he was able to put word out to all these Reform rabbis to tell them, go look around your synagogue and see if there's any records. And if there are, photocopy them and send them. And so you'll find hundreds of small collections from Western Pennsylvania in the American Jewish Archives because all of these rabbis were doing that. This is just one example that I found in the Frank family papers. Dr. Freehoff of Rodef Shalom congregation is talking to one of the descendants of William Frank, who is one of the three kind of founding Jewish families of Pittsburgh, Jewish Pittsburgh. And he's saying, I know your grandfather had this memoir. I think we should make a copy of it and send it to Cincinnati. That copy ends up in Jacob Rader Marcus's book, Memoirs of Early American Jews. We have the original copy here now, but you can see at the time, Dr. Freehoff was not thinking to keep that locally because there was nothing locally, there was nowhere locally to put it. So his thought was to send it to Cincinnati because Cincinnati had, by this point, was 6 years into their process, their project of creating a Jewish archive. It starts to change locally in the early 60s. The University of Pittsburgh starts to have these history professors in the early 60s who are interested in social history, meaning they want to know not just who are they don't just want to look at the Fricks and the Carnegies. They want to know what was life like for the average Pittsburgher, the average Western Pennsylvanian. And so Pitt created something that at the time was called the Archives of Industrial Society. And the idea was that they would go and they would find all of these congregational records, all of these ethnic organizational records, and they would start to create this foundation that could tell the story of all of this immigration and labor history that this region is so known for. And this is what a cartoonist thinks going out and finding archival records looks like. It's not that different. The clothing is different, but otherwise it's not that different. The Jewish story really starts to pick up in the late 60s for a couple reasons. One is that in 1968 is when the National Council of Jewish Women starts their oral history project, which we'll talk about a little bit. And the other was a project that a lot of people don't remember today. It was something called the Western Pennsylvania Jewish Historical Society, or the Jewish Historical Foundation, it's sometimes called. And it was started by these two Pitt professors. They were in the history department. They were both Jewish. And they had this idea that actually was incredibly innovative. It was so far ahead of its time that everybody thought it was ridiculous. And had they pulled it off, Pittsburgh would have the greatest local genealogy collection of all time. Their idea was this: Pitt had just gotten its first computer. And their idea was to go to all of the synagogues in town and get all the membership records and digitize them and enter them into this computer so that you would be able to go to the Pitt computer and type in a name and it would spit back all the data about family. And they actually started doing this. So they started it with an inventory and they went to, I think, 5 or 6 congregations and they just inventoried what records were available. They did not actually put the names in. So now you've now seen 2 inventories in this presentation, one in 1939 and one in 1969. And one of the lessons here is that it's not necessarily useful to inventory records. It's useful to inventory the information in the records, not just what the records are. So this was as far as this project went. And then it lost funding and they both went on their way to other projects. But this organization that they created, the Western Pennsylvania Jewish Historical Society or Jewish History Society, continued to be an entity with a name in town. It was sort of sponsored by the Rodef Shalom Congregation Men's Club and by what we would know today as PAJC, the Pittsburgh Area Jewish Committee. And so they would give talks every now and then, they would bring speakers to town, but they really weren't doing what they had been created to do, which was to save records. And so you can see in 1981, they're still saying like, this is a really good idea. We should still try and do this. But as is often the case, it's easier to get people interested in history than in the archives that underpin history. And so even though there was no appetite for an archive at this time, increasingly by the 80s, the Jewish community had enough distance from its own history to start to be interested in it. So one of the first big projects was Corinne Krauss in 1982 created an exhibit called Roots and Branches. And it was the first interpretive exhibit of Jewish history. And it got people in town interested in local Jewish history. Corinne Krauss was the first chair of our advisory committee, and her collection was the first big collection we got. So for us, it was really a foundational intellectual moment. Then a few years later, Jacob Feldman writes his book, The Jewish Experience in Western Pennsylvania. And this is not the first time there was a history written of Jewish Pittsburgh, but it was the first book-length history. And it was the first time anybody used archival data. So instead of just calling the kind of knower of the community, the oldest person in the community, and asking what they remember, he went to the census records, he went to the courthouse and got charters, he looked in the newspapers long before they were online. This was a project that was probably 20 or 30 years in the making, and it's still an incredible resource. I use it almost every single day for some purpose or another. So with these projects starting to get people interested, there was renewed interest in having an archive. And the effort that created the Rauh was started in 1987 when the Berkman family funded a one-year project called the Jewish Archival Survey. And the idea was they would go to every single Jewish organization in Western Pennsylvania and just find out what they had. And the idea was twofold. One was a feasibility study. Are there enough records out there to justify having an archive? And the other was a little bit of grassroots organizing. By the end of the project, everybody in town knew that there was this idea of starting an archive. And it worked. At the end of the year, they finished this Jewish Archival Survey. And they said there is actually enough information out there to justify having an archive. There's enough records that exist. So this is now the third inventory you've seen that's been created for this sets of records. Had they just created the archive back in 1939, we would have all the things that people are always calling, asking about, like these records from the Hill District and so on and so forth. So this is an example of what the Jewish Archival Survey was collecting. And because this is closer, these are closer to what we ended up getting. But when you look, we have this congregation's records. When you look, they still don't match. So there's still between 1987 and today stuff that got lost. Eventually, in November of 1988, they found the Jewish Archives. That photo there is Corinne Krauss, Bess Topolsky, and then on the other side are the Berkmans. And at that moment, we now have a repository that is dedicated solely to Jewish records from Western Pennsylvania. Between then and today, we've assembled about 1,000 collections or more, and those collections attempt to cover all aspects of Jewish life in the region. So that includes things that you would expect, like congregational records and organizational records, but we also have hundreds of family and business records that together should tell the experience of Jewish life in this region. And what you often find is that if people are connected to the Jewish community for a long enough period of time, they generally appear in the archive in some form. That continued on into the 21st century when, like everybody else, we started taking advantage of the digital offerings that were available to us. And so the two big ones were Historic Pittsburgh, which is a regional repository that multiple entities put their materials on, including the Heinz History Center. Another is the Pittsburgh Jewish Newspaper Project, which is hosted by Carnegie Mellon University and includes the 4 English language newspapers in Pittsburgh, English language Jewish newspapers in Pittsburgh. And those projects have been incredibly valuable for genealogical research. At the start of this year, the Rauh launched a new project called the Jewish Encyclopedia of Western Pennsylvania that attempts to be a clearinghouse for all of the Jewish records that are relevant to Western Pennsylvania. This is a project that builds off of an earlier website we did. We sort of changed the name of it and we expanded some of the capabilities of it. So on day one, it already had a lot of material. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, you know that every week we're very aggressively adding new material on here. trying to make this as robust as possible. As I said, the point of this is to be a clearinghouse. So the hope is that anybody doing research on any subject in Western Pennsylvania Jewry, not just genealogical, but historical, would come here and then be able to kind of branch out to other places, some of them here, some of them outside of here, that have those records. So you can see this is an example of the bibliography for the entry for the Pliskover Free Loan Association. This was a Landsmannschaft, a fraternal organization here in Pittsburgh. There were Pliskovers in a couple of cities, but Pittsburgh was sort of the headquarters of them. And so you can see how this bibliography works. For each of these, we give a link either to the catalog record, which would allow you to come into the archive and request that book or document. Or if they are already digitized, you can see where it says online, you can actually click those links and it'll take you straight to the digital resource. And this includes materials that are both here at the Rauh Jewish Archives as well. You see the oral histories at the bottom. Those are held at the University of Pittsburgh. So we're not segregating off. The idea is we want people to find records wherever they are. And then sometimes we'll even include the website of the organization itself, because for this particular group, there's actually some interesting genealogical material on their website. If you go to the resources page of our website, we have a list of all the repositories that are relevant to doing historical research on Jewish history in Western Pennsylvania. I say all, this is like everything. I'm constantly discovering more things and having to put more things up. But the point that I want to show you as we make our way through this is that the system that has evolved over these past 30 years is not efficient. Things are in multiple places. You often have to do multiple searches. Often within the same institution, you have to do multiple searches. So for an example, at the Heinz History Center, I showed you Historic Pittsburgh. I think a lot of people, they go to Historic Pittsburgh, they drop in the name, they see whatever comes back, and then they move on. There's actually 4 or 5 separate searches that you have to do just within the Heinz History Center. So one is our catalog. So you go to the catalog and you'll type something in, and the catalog is like the old library catalogs used to be. It's a very high level set of information. It'll have a historical note that gives you a little bit of background. It'll have a scope and content note telling you what's basically in a collection, and it'll have subject headings. But it does not include every single word that's in the larger finding aid. For that, you have to go to Historic Pittsburgh, and there you can get access to the full finding aids that are searchable. And that means that a search term that appears in the finding aid may not appear in the catalog record. Additionally, the Heinz History Center is a museum that has a huge museum collection. Someone was asking earlier about artifacts, and we have 50 or 60,000 artifacts in the museum, and increasingly those are being put online as well. And sometimes they're very relevant to genealogical research. And so you have to search that as well. Additionally, the Heinz History Center for more than 100 years now has run a magazine called it's now called Western Pennsylvania History. And the entire run of that magazine is available online, searchable through Penn State University. So you also have to search that. That doesn't even get into the Jewish Encyclopedia website, the various databases. So you can see you really have to be thoughtful and strategic and willing to kind of methodically go through each of these. And that's just for us. Then there's the University of Pittsburgh, which I mentioned has been collecting things longer than we have. So you can go to Historic Pittsburgh and you can get access to their materials there, but they also have their own catalog that does not necessarily mirror Historic Pittsburgh. And they have the larger University of Pittsburgh catalog called PitCat, which sometimes will have information that's not on either of those other websites. And as you start to drill down into the University of Pittsburgh website, you'll sometimes find that they have collections that are somewhat siloed from the rest of the digital repository. And one of the ones that's probably most useful for genealogy is the Pitt News. So this was the student newspaper at the University of Pittsburgh. It doesn't always come up on a main search. You have to go find the Pitt News website within the university's archives website. Then there's the American Jewish Archives, which was the first of all these. You can use their catalog and you can find records from all of these communities in Western Pennsylvania, but they also have their own journal. And there have been times over the years when people like Feldman or Corinne Krauss or Ida Sullivan were writing articles about Pittsburgh. And especially if your ancestors go way back to the founding of the community, there are times when they appear in these articles. Additionally, they have the records of Isaac Mayer Wise there. And he was interacting with all of these nascent Reformed communities, including in Pittsburgh. So if you have ancestors who were here in the 1850s or early 1860s, you have to check this archive as well. And then over the years, there have started to be these tools that take all of these digitized resources and start to play with them and make them more useful. And these can be really helpful as you're starting to do research. So this is a website called Pittsburgh Historic Maps, and it's based off of the mapping system that ESRI runs. And what it allows you to do is all those little boxes on the side are the various years that have historic maps available. And they have been tagged to the GIS system. So it allows them to anchor these maps onto the current surveying system. And then you can run down through those checkboxes and you can see a specific spot in Pittsburgh at these various intervals. The reason that this is helpful is because sometimes, especially for Jewish history, there are parts of the city that have been changed very dramatically. And Pittsburgh feels so old that we often think that the city is kind of exactly the same as it was 100 years ago. But if you had ancestors in the lower hill, that's all gone. And so sometimes you'll get an address and you'll have absolutely no idea if the street will be gone, or you'll remember hearing the street like Logan Street, but you have no idea where that particular address is on Logan. So with this, you can zoom in, find the address, then you can move over to the current mapping system and figure out where that building would have been located. It's a very useful tool. And then additionally, there's a great website locally called, I've never actually determined whether it's retrographer or retrographer. But what they did was they took all of the photographs from the Pittsburgh City Photographer Collection, which is a wonderful collection that's held at the University of Pittsburgh. It's tens of thousands of photographs of just street scenes in Pittsburgh, usually public works projects. And they throw them on this website and they allow people to figure out where the photograph was taken and anchor it to that spot so that you can, if you know the address, you can look at the address today and see if there is a photograph of it in the Pittsburgh City Photographer Collection. And then if you really want to go nuts on your research, you can go to Three Rivers Archivists, which is a local archivist professional organization. And a couple years ago, all of us got together and we created what we hope is a definitive list of every single archival repository in Western Pennsylvania. And so you can start to see that really it's much more than just dropping a name into a search engine. There are all these repositories all over the place. And then what started to happen is over the past few years, these digital projects have accommodated a range of new projects that never would have been possible pre-digital. So for example, Tammy Heps's Homestead Hebrews project, she has created a website that has essentially documented every Jewish person known to have lived in Homestead, Pennsylvania, and listed out where in every single record they're found. That's the most ambitious of them. But there's a lot of other people. There's people in Greenville, PA, who did something similar. They found every Jewish person in Greenville. Someone did it for Brownsville recently. There's someone in Butler who's been working on a project. So you can see that as these tools have become available, we're in the second generation now of people creating these really useful resources. Okay, so you've got this humongous landscape. It's clear that it's not simply sufficient to just drop a name in. How do you do the research? How do you find material in the archive? So what I like to do is a two-step process. This is what I do when people call us for information about their ancestors. The first is that I prepare a chronology. So I use all those available digital resources to compile a list of addresses, dates, and affiliations. I should put names on there as well, but I feel like if you're searching for somebody, it's obvious you're looking for their name. So what do? I go down the list, and a lot of these were ones that Emily mentioned. So you start with the US Census, and now you got at 10-year intervals. Where was this person? Where did they live? What were they doing? Who were the other people in their lives? Then I go to the city directories, and that fills you in on the gaps between those 10 years. The city directories up to 1930 are on historic Pittsburgh. But after 1930, you have to come into the archive to do that research in person. So we have them from 1931 into the 20th century, but they're not online. So you start by creating that city directory list. That gives you the information between the censuses, and it also gives you additional things that sometimes aren't in the census. So the census will often list profession, but it doesn't always list the name of the company that you are employed with or associated with. For the city directories, what I tend to do is I look at the 10 and the 5-year, and then if there's a difference, then I look at the 3 and the 7, and then if there's a difference, I look at 1, 2, 4, and then 6, 8, 9. So you don't always have to pull up every single one unless you're trying to be exceptionally thorough. Then I run the person's name through Historic Pittsburgh, and I try to see, are they popping up in finding aids? Are they popping up in books? Are they popping up in some of the newspapers that are on there? One of the newspapers that is on Historic Pittsburgh is the Squirrel Hill News, which is obviously very useful for Jewish genealogy. Then I run them through the Pittsburgh Jewish Newspaper Project. The Pittsburgh Jewish Newspaper Project includes newspapers from 1895 to 2010. And so it has an incredibly wide range of material. It has all of the obituaries. It has birth notices. It has marriage notices. It has all of the information about people donating to things. It has information about awards that people have been given. It has membership lists sometimes, confirmation lists. And then it also has yard site information because of the Jewish Home for the Aged column that is still, I think, runs in the Chronicle today. So that information is in there as well. And then I look through the national ones, so newspapers.com. We're very lucky in Western Pennsylvania that not only are a lot of the city newspapers digitized and available on newspapers.com, but a lot of the small town ones are as well. Then I go to Ancestry. I don't do a deep dive through Ancestry. I just do a quick thing to see if there's any other information I might be missing. And then finally, I drop the name into some of the big archival catalogs just to see. If there's already a collection, then you don't have to go to all the hassle of hunting someone down. And this is what something like this would look like when I'm done. So I generally do this organizational in Excel, and I do that for a few reasons. One is it's very common, so it translates easily if you have to send it somewhere. It's very easy to organize and reorganize data. Excel allows you to sort and filter. Another thing that I love about Excel, and I don't think a lot of people realize this, is that if you input addresses with full postal listings, you can ingest an Excel spreadsheet into Google Maps, and it will automatically create a map for you, which can be very helpful. Sometimes you think you know where these places are, but you don't realize their proximity or their distance. Sometimes you have no idea where they are, and it turns out there is a working address there today, and it'll tell you automatically. It's just a very useful tool. Also with Excel, you can, if you want, you can start to run things about the dates and a lot of other things. It's just an incredibly powerful tool that most of us already have on our computers. So what this tells me is it gives me, I was looking particularly at 2 people in this family, Morris Haas and a son, Edgar Haas. And you can see the range of dates. So I've got a pretty nice selection of dates here. I'm over a 70-year period. I've got a lot of addresses to work with. And then in that last column there, it's a combination of what they do for a living and things they're affiliated with, essentially organizational. So I have 3 things there. I've got this Pittsburgh Cornice and Roofing Company. I've got Tree of Life. This person is involved with Tree of Life. And I have a connection with the YM and WHA, the Young Men's and Women's Hebrew Association. So with this spreadsheet, now I can take this information and apply it to the archival catalog to make it easier to do in-person research. So that's step 2. You take the information that you've gotten from the digital things that you can do at home, and you bring that into the archive to do a very narrow targeted search of archival records. So for example, if we type in Young Men's Hebrew Association, which this person was involved in, you can see just typing that in, we get 18 collections that pop up that have to do with the Young Men's Hebrew Association. And if you were to scroll down, you would see, I'm sure a lot of you, if you grew up here, know this, but if you didn't, you would discover that the Young Men's and Women's Hebrew Association is the Jewish Community Center. So now you've made this broader connection. You have two organizations that you're looking for to see if records exist. When you search for the Jewish Community Center, you get this huge list, 71 collections in the archive. That means there's 71 collections that could potentially include this person that you're looking for. So now that's a lot. So you want to start to drill down using those dates that you've collected to see, do any of the records cover the date range of the person that you're looking for? And so as we go through it, we see that, yes, the archive happens to have a great collection from the Jewish Community Center of Greater Pittsburgh. This is the records collection. You can see that it's 31 feet. That's 62 boxes of records. So that's a lot, right? Are you going to come here and spend a whole summer going through 62 boxes? Well, you don't have to. On the side where it says arrangement, it's telling you that this collection has certain series to it. So for example, Emma Kaufman Camp. That's one selection of these records. We don't need to worry about that. Another one is the Henry Kaufman Family Recreation Park. We don't need to worry about that. And as you make your way down, you'll see that there is a section for the Young Men's and Women's Hebrew Association. Okay, well, this is actually pretty useful. And we can see at the bottom there in box 43, folder 5, it says members, and the date range is 1914 to 1943. Well, that's actually a pretty useful folder. It's the institution we're looking for, and it's the dates we're looking for. So now all you do is you just come in and you request that one folder, and it takes you about 10 minutes to go through it. And you've either found something or you haven't, but it's a very quick process. And you can kind of build up, 5 or 10 of these, and then make a day where you come down for an afternoon and you spend an hour or two and just kind of make your way through all of them. This collection also has a photographic component as well. And so you can do this same process, isolate the Young Men's and Women's Hebrew Association section. And we can see at the top there, there's an interesting, kind of intriguing thing. There's a charter from the organization, and it's dated 1914, which fit with the dates that we're looking for. And when we pull up the charter, we see there's our person. Here he's listed as Edward Haas, but it's the same person, Edgar Haas. And so, wow, this is a great document. If you're doing genealogical research and you happen to discover this, this is not something you would find through any internet search. You wouldn't find this through any search of any of the digital materials, but you can find it through about, if you're strategic, you can find it through about 5 minutes of catalog searching and 10 minutes in the archive. Additionally, we had said that this family had some connection to Tree of Life. So for this particular one, that came from Historic Pittsburgh, and it was that this person's name popped up in a Tree of Life Golden Book. So we look and we see that the University of Pittsburgh has a collection from Tree of Life. And when we go into it, we find this time capsule that was taken out of the Kraft Avenue building just a few years ago. It's really, as you can see, very oxidized, so you can't see it. But on the top, if you look at it, it actually says that this box is made by Morris Haas. And if you remember from that list that we had, Morris Haas was in the tinware business. So it adds up that he would have made this box. So this is the kind of thing you would never find that box anywhere in any sort of online collection. But if you're able to follow the path, this organizational path, you can very easily look for all the places where things might hide. And sometimes you don't find anything, but sometimes you do. Then what you can do is take that information back to the Jewish encyclopedia that we're creating. So you may have noticed that all of those addresses where they lived were deep in the South Hills of Pittsburgh, places where we assume Jews never lived, right? Bellshoover, Knoxville, Allentown. And it turns out that there was a little Jewish congregation out there called the Hilltop Jewish Community Club. And on the website, we have a list of everybody who was known to be affiliated with that club. And as you look through, you can see not only Edgar Haas, but you can see a Gershon Haas, a Rauh Haas, a Theodore Haas. And so now you have other names that you can go and start to run that whole process back over again from start to finish. So that's just a quick overview of kind of the materials that are available in Western Pennsylvania and how you can use them. We encourage you to come by anytime. The archive is open without an appointment, Wednesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. I'm obviously not here on Saturday, so if you want to see me in particular, it's always good to email me first so we can schedule a time. And I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has, if anybody has any. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for coming out today. And I hope that was helpful. We'll send out, for those of you who either didn't get it or lose the paper, we'll send out Emily's handouts. I have another handout with a lot of this information on it. And as always, you're always welcome to contact the History Center, contact the Jewish Genealogy Society anytime you need any help with anything. And thanks for coming out.